Hey everybody, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our topic 5.8, as well as our topic on aquaculture, which should be 5.16. So here we go. I know that today in class we talked about sustainable agricultural practices, and we've been discussing, how we raise crops versus how we raise cattle and livestock. Well, another really important piece to the food industry is fisheries. We learned in the very beginning of the year when we did our Tragedy of the Commons lab the impacts of overfishing and what needs to be done in order to reduce the amounts of overfishing, because now we're going to look at some of the impacts here. So we can see in the first bullet, we know overfishing has led to extreme scarcity of some fish species. With the overfishing, we see much less biodiversity in aquatic systems, and we know from Unit 2, right, less biodiversity means typically less resilient, more vulnerable to then disruptions. We know it harms people who depend upon fish for food as well as commerce. Typically, coastal areas highly depend upon the fish that they have in that given area. And if that fishery tends to collapse, then that town will face tremendous economic consequences. Now, some fishing techniques that we should be familiar with when we talk about overfishing are some of the ones that we see in the picture that I have here. So you'll see this would be like an example of long lining here. Typically, when you kind of stretch out one specific line there, you can see we have nets here. This is called a purse seine net, which is going to gather lots and lots of fish. Here we have a trawl bag. This is where we often see nets being pretty much strung along the bottom of the then ocean, which tends to then gather organisms that are typically bottom feeders. But there's tremendous impacts to the aquatic ecosystems when we capture fish the way we do. And one of those unintended consequences is known as bycatch. So when we use things like these nets and bottom trawling here, we know that's especially harmful because it's going to catch unintended species, things like dolphins and whales and turtles, as well as harm then the ocean floor ecosystem as well. So out of the most harmful fishing techniques we have is typically bottom trawling. We know that other fishing techniques can stir up that ocean sediment. It can make it far more turbid, meaning very dark in color. We know it can destroy coral reef structures, decrease biodiversity by killing non-target species, and potentially removing coral reef habitats, which we know create ecosystems for many, many different organisms. So what are the solutions to then these fishing techniques and overfishing? What can we do to kind of mitigate those problems? So that brings me to 5.16. And actually, you can kind of see it in the picture over here all the way to the left. That is going to be aquaculture. Now, aquaculture is typically when we raise fish as though they're kind of like on a farm in a way. So you can kind of see that in the picture here. We have given areas like little pools of water where we're going to farm specific types of fish. Typically, we farm lots of salmon and tuna, lots of very common types of fish. Some of the pros of aquaculture is it can be highly efficient, requires small areas of water, and it can require very little fuel, because now you don't have to go out and actually, fill up your boat with fuel and capture fish. Some of the cons, however, is that it can contaminate wastewater. We know that we are enclosing these fish species in closer quarter waters. The waste that they generate can potentially contaminate nearby waterways. Those farm fished fish may end up escaping. They can potentially compete with wild fish that we see in the sea. They can also carry sea lice or maybe even some parasites. And the density of the fish can lead to increases in disease incidences, which then can be transmitted to our wild fish. Now, although these cons may seem very serious, aquaculture is a tremendous solution to overfishing. Aquaculture has allowed us to raise fish such as salmon. And because we are farm raising these salmon, it puts less pressure on the wild salmon. And so, although the cons may seem quite serious, aquaculture has definitely changed the way that we tend to fish. Now, here is a little practice FRQ. So here in the question, it says primary consumers like tilapia and scallops and secondary consumers like salmon and trout are both harvested in the wild as well as raised in aquaculture. So the first question here, a shopper in the seafood section of their food market believes that purchasing farmed tilapia is a better choice for the environment than purchasing farmed salmon. Make a claim using evidence that supports or refutes this assertion. Another shopper believes that purchasing farmed scallops is a better choice for the environment than purchasing wild scallops. Make a claim by citing an environmental problem associated with one of the options. So here, take a second in the practice FRQ. If you want, jot down in the space that I've provided for you guys what you believe your answer to be. So at this point, you might want to pause the video. Okay, guys, at this point, you should have paused the video and come up with some answers. So let's take a look at what we put. So here are some of the possible College Board accepted answers. So recall A was asking us to make a claim using evidence that might support or refute the fact that this person believed purchasing our farmed tilapia was a better choice for the environment versus our farmed salmon. Well, if you can recall the information they gave us in the beginning half of our FRQ, they told us that tilapia were primary consumers, and so we know that they're going to eat much lower on the food chain, right? They need to eat less because they get more energy. This means that we know they require less energy versus our, say, farmed salmon, which we know are secondary consumers. And so because they require less energy and biomass, they're better for the environment. Taking a look at B, here our shopper believed that purchasing our farmed scallops was a better choice for the environment than purchasing our wild scallops. So you had to make a claim by citing an environmental problem associated with one. So here's a few things that we could have said. Recall, farmed scallops or scallops that are raised via aquaculture can potentially increase nutrient concentration in the water, causing algal blooms. That was when I mentioned it can cause water contamination because of their waste. They're also grown in high population densities, and we know that makes them more vulnerable to then spreading diseases or parasites. But in wild caught scallops, biggest issues here is how they're harvested. They tend to be harvested by bottom trawling. And remember, we said that that is the fishing technique and where they drag a net along the ocean floor that can kick up lots of ocean sediment. It can also create bycatch and where we kill non-target species. Those trawlers or boats consume lots of fossil fuels, and so using and operating that equipment can put in more carbon dioxide emissions and air pollutants. It can also endanger those wild scallops, as well as reduce their availability in terms of the food chain or food web. All right, guys, make sure that you watch this video, you took your notes, and should complete those Albert IO questions.